Happy Sabbath. I hope you all had a wonderful, wonderful week. Tonight, I pray to the Lord to be present in your life, to guide you in each decision, bless you with His love, and plenty of blessings pour upon you and your family. Also, to always keep you safe and secure. Last week, we talked about Abram went to war. This week, we'll continue the story of Abram in chapter 15 of Genesis. Let's start reading. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. Why did God tell Abram not to fear in this passage? After battling with the four kings to rescue Lot and the others, Abram returned to his tent and his flocks. But he was troubled. He had worries. You see, before the war, most of the time, Abram has been living a peaceful life. He tried to avoid conflicts and disagreements, even with his nephew. And now, as he recalled the scene of killing in the battlefield, he was filled with fear, probably fearing the revenge of the defeated nations, that they might renew their strength and return for revenge. If I were him, my mind would be troubled too. Can you imagine if he had to keep defending himself and his family in order to claim the promised land? That would not be a peaceful life. Furthermore, he was also troubled by the thought that he would fail God. How could he be the progenitor of a great nation if he had no children? Precisely, it was at this moment that the word of the Lord came. God told him, Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. So when Abram was fearful, word of the Lord came. This phrase typically introduces a revelation from God to a prophet. You can see that in Jeremiah chapter 18, verse 1, Ezekiel chapter 6, verse 1, Hosea chapter 1, verse 1. So God was about to reveal something to Abram. And this word of the Lord came through a vision. Visions were an ancient mode of revelation. And oftentimes it occurs at night, as we observed here in this passage and also in other passages like in Job 33, 14 to 16 and 1 Samuel 3, verse 1 to 3. Now I'm going to pause for a moment to comment on something that I have just learned. Can you see from what we have studied so far in Genesis that God is clearly the initiator and preserver of his people from the fallen world? God took extra effort to reveal himself to individuals for the sake of the mass. Look at these three individuals. Adam, although he has sinned, but he was preserved from the fallen race. He was to pass on God's promise to his descendants. God's promise in Genesis 3:15 about the plan of salvation. God also preserved Noah when the entire world was evil. The wickedness of man was great in the earth, according to Genesis chapter 6. From Noah, there was going to be a lineage of righteous people, God's people. And now God chose Abram from Mesopotamia, a place that was saturated with idol-worshipping traditions. Abram was chosen to be the progenitor of God's great nation. Isn't it wonderful? God, He did not give us up. He kept choosing people so that they could influence the rest. So now let's go back to the story. Just now we mentioned about Abram's fear. Besides afraid of having to fight more battles, he was also worried about being old and still childless. Abram was probably wondering in his mind, what does God mean when he said he would bless me? When I and my wife are growing older and still childless. In their time, childlessness was seen as a sign of divine judgment, which is opposite of blessing. You can read more about it in Leviticus 20:20 and 21, 1 Samuel 1:11. And Jeremiah 22, verse 30. So here we see in verse 2, Abram starts to express what he had been thinking, expressing it to God. And if you examine the story of Abram, Genesis chapter 15, verse 2 is the first time recorded that Abram spoke to God. Previously, God spoke to him, and Abraham just obeyed, but did not speak in return. But here in this passage, Abram raised the question of how the promise would be fulfilled when he had no children. Interesting observation that even though Abram raised question, we were told he had unwavering faith. So having faith doesn't mean that we cannot ask question for understanding. God told Abram that his reward would be great because he placed God in the center of his faith and confidence. Abram answered God and asked what would be his reward when he was still childless. In fact, he resigned to the fact that he and his wife were too old to birth a child, so he had designated his servant as his heir. In those days, there was a practice that when a couple had no children, they would adopt a slave or a servant as their heir. How do we know that? Recently some archaeologists has found evidence of this tradition in some Nuzi texts dated back in 1500 BC. Where's Nuzi? Nuzi is a city in Mesopotamia. And archaeologists not just found one or two tablets, but found quite a few collections, over 4,000 clay tablets there. And where's Nuzi now? It is near today's Kirkuk city in Iraq. Abram's question provided the backdrop for the central issue of this chapter. God's apparent delay in fulfilling his promises. When God promised Abram that his offspring will possess the land of Canaan, Abram was 75 years old. That was chapter 12. And now in chapter 15, he was probably about 86 years old, 11 years later. The issue here is the same as the one faced by God's people all throughout the ages, waiting for the promise of God to be fulfilled. Since Adam, his people were waiting for the Messiah to come. And during the time of the apostles, they were waiting for Christ's second coming. And we are still waiting. Why? We'll address this in a minute. Here, Abram too must wait in faith for the fulfillment of the promise. And he was counted as righteous in his faith. Even though he realized that the promise was far off to another generation, he trusted God. It is comforting to observe that God continued to assure Abraham in the same direction, that Abraham will have his own son, and his heir will not be his servant. Let's read on, verse 5. And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward the heaven, and number of the stars. If you are able to number them," then he said to him, "so shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. This verse provides the early core doctrine of justification by faith, not by works. Abraham believed the promise of the birth of an heir from the dead, meaning he and his wife were old and biologically could not birth any child. And because Abraham continued to trust God, God counted Abraham to be righteous. Abraham met God's covenant demand. Abraham's justification by faith is a model of our faith in believing the resurrection of Jesus Christ, God's sacrifice for our sin, and God's crediting his righteousness to us by faith. We are to be like him, though we may not understand everything, but we continue to have faith in our Lord. Furthermore, Abram's father of all who believed, and that means all, not only Jews. Anyone, everyone who believe are called children of Abraham. We can find that in Galatians chapter 3, verse 7. And we can count the amount of Jews in the world today, which is about 15 million. But God said Abram's offspring would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. That means he's counting us too, those who have faith in him. We are all Abraham's descendants. Now let's read verse 7. And he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess." But he said, "O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" He said to him, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." God again confirmed his promise that he will give Abram Canaan. Abram had a question. This is not a question of hidden accusation of God at the delayed fulfillment. Abram was genuinely requesting for more information and assurance. In response, God affirmed his covenant with Abram in a remarkable ceremony. God told him to bring a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Notice all the species here were suitable for sacrifice. So verse 10, it continues. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and lay each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Abram obeyed as God said. He divided them in the middle. Cutting, the ceremony, cutting, is a covenant that conveys the idea that the same will be done to the one who breaks this covenant. Ancient covenants were sometimes confirmed by the halving of the sacrificial victims, and the two parties to the covenant were to pass between these animals. And we found those in the Mari tablets, and also we could see that in Jeremiah chapter 34, verse 18 and 19. In this case, though, God alone passes between the animal pieces in the form of a smoking furnace from which torchlight flames shoot out. Because this covenant with Abram is unconditional and can be carried out only by God himself. So Abraham did not walk past through these animals, only God did. God was symbolically represented by this smoking furnace at the torch. And the verse also said, birds of prey came down on the carcasses. What does that represent? Symbolically, this is about the unclean nations seeking to destroy the descendants of Abraham, but they were being chased away. Or here the verse says, drove them away. So Abraham symbolically defend the promised land, defend the promised inheritance against foreign attackers. Let's start reading verse 12 now. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. God put Abram to sleep. Perhaps the covenant did not involve any promise on his part. He would not walk through the pieces as a pledge. The words of God in the covenant ceremony assure Abram that his descendants would definitely be in the promised land, although a painful detour into Egypt would delay the fulfillment. This vision is a revelation that Abram's offspring will be in a land that is not theirs. God promised. They will be stranger in a foreign land for 400 some years, actually 430 years to be exact. Then God would judge that nation and bring Israel out with great substance. And we could see that in Exodus chapter 12, verse 34 to 36. And God will use his great nation, the Israelite, as a mean of judgment upon the inhabitants of Canaan. And this is when the iniquity, the sin of the Amorites would be full. Verse 15. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. Smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. Again, I have mentioned before that these items symbolize the presence of God, who solemnly promised by divine oath to fulfill his promises to Abram by alone passing through the animal pieces. The fact that God alone passed through these carcasses suggests that God is unconditionally making this covenant. Verse 18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. God's covenant with Abram closely parallels ancient Near Eastern royal land grants made by kings to loyal servants and their descendants in perpetuity. I think I mentioned in the previous chapters. The covenant was grant of land from the river of Egypt, today it's called Wadi el Arish, to the river Euphrates in Syria. These borders were only extended to this length under the reigns of David and Solomon. You can see that in 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 19. So they did not get it right away, but during the reign of David and Solomon, we see that the promised land, the land of Israel, was from the border of Egypt to all the way to Euphrates, the border of river Euphrates. Now let's read verse 19. The land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. The various people who inhabited the land are named here. Such precise detailing of the nations in the land of Canaan attests again to the specificity of the promised land in God's promises. So, what does this narrative tell us about God's character? God doesn't change. His promises do not change. You can see this in the Abram story. God gave him the same promise from chapter 12 to chapter 17. Disregard of the time span or events happening that seem to prevent the fulfillment. And what does this say about humanity? Man always tries to guess God, even Abram, who is considered as righteous. He was getting old and thought maybe God would follow their tradition, so he designated Eliezer as his heir. Men are impatient. When God promised certain thing, when God bless certain thing, it will surely come through. But sometimes he selects the most appropriate time to fulfill his promise. He did not do it immediately. Perhaps we are not ready. Third question, what does it tell us about how to live? God should be our object of faith and confidence no matter what happened. Although Abram had questions, but his world remained centered in the Lord. He trusted God's faithfulness and wisdom. Next week, we'll continue in chapter 16. Happy Sabbath.